Okay, hi everybody. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Morgan. I'm one of the PhD students. Chris Young is my supervisor, and I am looking at the assemblages and movements of bats in an urban landscape. I'm also doing DNA studies on those bats. I'm going to talk to you a bit about my research today, but first I'm going to go through kind of like the theory behind it, and a bit about kind of why I'm studying what I'm studying, and how the theory of bat behavior in an urban landscape has led to the development of my survey methodology. I've got the chat open. If you have any questions, just go ahead and put it in the chat. And also as you can see, my email is here. So if you have any questions afterwards, then feel free to ask. But if you see my cat behind, her name's Sola. She does tend to interrupt Zoom calls and things. Right, so there are, I don't know if the sound is going to share on the videos, but I do have some videos to show you, and lots of pictures of cool bats. So hopefully they'll work. We will see. Okay, so we're going to talk about some basic terminology with regard to urban ecology. And we're going to look at how that kind of relates to bats and whether it's applicable or not. We're going to talk a bit about how bats behave in urban areas and what constitutes a barrier to them, and how that might differ from other animals, and also what the conservation implications of that are. So the first sort of bit of terminology around urban animals is the idea of a synanthrope. So synanthropic species are those which have an association with humans in particular, or with anthropogenic environments, and that they benefit from our activities. And that might be because we provide them with some aspect of their lifestyle, some kind of thing that they need, and we make it easier to get than if they were in a wild landscape. So pigeons living in our cities, taking advantage of all the rubbish that we leave around, urban foxes doing incredibly well compared to rural foxes because of how much food there is around, because of how much we throw away, that kind of thing. So those are animals that are benefiting from our activities. And then in particular, there's a sort of a subset of that, which is synerbic. And that doesn't just relate to anthropogenic environments, because obviously we affect our landscape in much more areas than just cities, but specifically species who respond positively to an urban environment in particular. So some examples of that are, for example, synerbic synanthropes. So they're synanthropic because they benefit from human activities, but they're synerbic because they particularly benefit from cities, and that's excuse me, brown rats, foxes, pigeons, peregrine falcons, although that's kind of arguable, because all the way through this, you'll be able to sort of argue that many of the things that the urban environment provides these animals is an analog for something that they would find naturally. So with peregrine falcons, they nest on buildings in cities, and that's an analog for a cliff. And it just happens to be that the fact that our cities provide a lot of food for pigeons, and so pigeons flourish, and so there's a really good food source for peregrines, and so they have all of the food that they need, and they have high, safe nesting places, which is what they need as well. So whether that is particularly a feature of that we have created, or whether it's just a good substitute for them, which makes it calorically beneficial compared to wild hunting. But then you get other species which are associated with humans, like barn owls, or perhaps rural badgers around farms. They benefit from our crops. They benefit from the mice that flourish around where we're storing grain, for example, in the case of barn owls. And so they're associated with humans. They benefit from humans. They're synanthropes, but they're not necessarily urban synanthropes. And then it gets a bit more complicated because Francis, who posited all of this, has said that basically that synerbic should refer to species whose affinity to urban environments is greater than their affinity to other habitats. And there are also arguments that you shouldn't say that a species is synanthropic or not. You should say that a particular population of a species, that the species has the capacity to be. So you do get urban badgers, and then you get rural badgers. And that doesn't mean that badgers are all synerbic synanthropes. It just means that certain populations of badgers are synerbic. So then you get the idea of urban avoiders, urban adapters, and urban exploiters, and that's a really common way to look at it. You don't really hear people really talk about synanthropes much, I suppose, because it's friendlier language to say that something is urban adapted. And this is very old terminology. Broad brush, animals that reach their highest densities and natural sites are urban avoiders. Adapters, most abundant in moderately developed areas. I'd argue with this quite considerably, and then exploiters reach their greatest densities in highly modified habitats. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that just because an animal does well in an urban environment and can thrive in an urban environment, it's not necessarily going to do better in an urban environment than it is in a rural environment. So this was tweaked slightly in 2015 with the idea of an urban avoider rarely occurring in developed areas. And then a utilizer being an animal that will use an urban area for some part of its life cycle, but not for breeding. And that an urban dweller is breeding in these built-up environments. So this is a bit more conservation based, a bit more about what parts of the animal's life cycle the urban environment is supporting, but you get the idea that nothing's kind of set in stone, and there are a lot of it's open to interpretation. And I certainly don't think that this is perfect, and you'll see why shortly. Another thing that Fisher talks about is urban habitat types, whether they're natural or developed, and defines them, as you can see here, minimally modified or unmodified or substantially altered for anthropic purposes. But you can be substantially altered for anthropic purposes and not be urban. So, agriculture is a perfect example of that. And again, this comes down to sort of whether these habitats are being utilized because of their anthropogenic origins, or because it just makes a really good analog for something that the animal would find naturally. It's just easier to find it because we're so messy, I guess, and provide such good habitat in so many ways. First cute bat picture. Is that the first one? I don't know. It's a cute bat. This is a natterer's bat. I'll tell you what the species are as we go through. This is a species that you can identify by their see how their ears are kind of flicked back a little bit away from their head. They have these quite nice curved back ears. And they're also known as the red-armed bat colloquially because they've got a bit of a red tinge to the forearms. Anyway, so some bat species are referred to as being synanthropic. In particular, we tend to think of the common pipistrelle as being very, very well urban adapted, and that is the case. And on the this is one of those things where you talk about you'll have populations that are urban adapted and populations that aren't, because, for example, the serotine bat, Apesicus serotinus, is not an urban adapted species in the UK, but it is on the continent. So that's again that variance in population, and just it just shows you that you can have these adaptable behaviors and even physiological characteristics that can vary, geographically. So, and so when you come to bats, at best, Blair 1966 would have called them adapters because they can be abundant in moderately developed areas. But Fisher would definitely call them a dweller, which would imply that just because an animal can breed in this urban area, that makes them like the highest level of synerbic that you can get, and that's not the case. A lot of the times with these animals, they are just eking out an existence, and what remains to be seen is how much of a genetic barrier a lot of the urban infrastructure is. That's one of the things I'm hoping to be able to look at. So, with urban bat assemblages, generally speaking, it is thought of that one or two species tend to dominate. So the idea that you might have, so we have in the UK there are 17 species of bats. The further north you go, the fewer you get. I think there are 9 in Scotland. I might be making that up. But here in the West Midlands, there are 12. And so, generally speaking, the species richness is here, but it's still a population that's dominated by a few very common species. And typically in the UK, the common pipistrelle is not badly named at all. They are the most common species. So you're looking at more than 50% of bat records generally in an urban area will be dominated by a common species. And that's true all over the world, really, by and large. So you're talking about in some areas, say Tadarida brasiliensis, the Brazilian free-tailed bat will be a dominant species. Here in the UK, it's definitely the common pipistrelle. And just to show you, these are the records from 2018, so before I started doing my project. So it's very well, it's quite a bit different now, and that's kind of a story for another day. But you are going to see a map shortly that's going to be more up to date. But when I started, this is what I was looking at for my baseline data. And as you can see, so we do have a lot of aggregates in the records database. So a lot of records, 16% of records just say bat, and don't even go down to genus level, or let alone species level. A number of species, so as you can see, sort of 8% of records are just say pipistrellus. But you can still see that even if you consider all of those records, the aggregate records and the ones that are just for a bat, pipistrellus, common pipistrelle, is still represents 46%. And if you're just considering records to species levels, it's 63.8%. So they are a very, very dominant species. But there are a lot of other things at play rather than just the abundance and distribution of that species. So when you see a distribution map of a species, you're not looking at a distribution map of that species. You're looking at a distribution map of records of that species. And so essentially, there's a lot of inbuilt bias. It's the best we can do because all we have is record. That's how we know how all animals are doing. How IUCN assesses the rarity of endangered species is basically just looking at records, but there's a lot of inherent bias in records. Not the least, the likelihood of encounter. Now, as much as we've got 12 species living in our county, most of those species tend to be eking out an existence in what's left of fragments of woodland habitat and an urban fringe and greenbelt. And because they're doing that, the species that people are more likely to encounter, especially because they're nocturnal and people don't tend to go to the woods at night, the species that you're most likely to encounter are the ones that are most likely to be in your domestic dwellings, and that is common pipistrelle. So it seems, if you think about it, it's a no-brainer that we're much more likely to record common pipistrelle because they're the ones that like central heating and live in people's houses. And so it makes sense that there would be a lot more records of common pipistrelle than other species, and not enough to compensate for the fact that there are more common pipistrelles than other bats, but certainly enough to make that difference between species exaggerated, because we're more likely to see them. Another thing is that a lot of these species, you have to identify them in the hand. They're what you call cryptic species. So a lot of times you have to look at dentition, genitalia, all different kinds of stuff to sort of separate them apart. And even those that you can identify quite readily from looking at them, you don't tend to be holding a bat when you see it. It tends to be flying around. And so if you're going to be identifying species that aren't even necessarily in your house, if you are going out to the woods at night with a bat detector, it has to be a species that you can reliably separate to species level using acoustic analysis. And there aren't that many species that you can do that with, because all the myotis, with the exception of Dorbenton's bats, and sometimes when you get a very good call, Natterer's bats, you can't tell myotis bats apart. So in the UK, that's 6 species. So there's 4 of them which you can't separate from each other. I mean, if you're in a really good environment and you get a really good call with really good equipment, you can sometimes, but generally speaking, we can tell Daubenton's bats mostly. You can tell Natter's bats mostly, but then you're looking at common and soprano pipistrelle, noctules, and brown long-eared bats, and everything else you really need to have in the hand in order to get to have confidence in your identification. Another thing is that people tend to record common pipistrelle because that's the one they've heard of. That's the one that's on Spring Watch, or that's, its public profile of a species is, more people will record wood mice than water shrews, and a encounter is a thing, but many people haven't heard of a water shrew, and it's just that whole what's in someone's landscape. And if someone doesn't have that word in their mental landscape, they're not going to be submitting records of that species if they've never heard of it. They may even make assumptions, which is the next one. People assuming that I'm an iRecord verifier. I don't know if you guys know what iRecord is, but it's basically you submit your biological records to an online repository, and then it goes to a verifier to look at the feasibility of whether that species could or should or has been recorded in that area, and then it gets verified and sent to the local record centres. Now, I do that for Worcestershire, Warwickshire, and Staffordshire, and on almost a daily basis, people send me records of common pipistrelles, and the method of recording says visual sighting from a distance. Now, I know that's not possible. They put common pipistrelle because that's a species it's most likely to be, and they're guessing and submitting records based on that guess. And if I email them, this literally happened today. I emailed someone yesterday and said, you've recorded a common pipistrelle, but you said your method was visual sighting. Did you use a bat detector? And she emailed me back and said, no, I just assumed that that's what it was. And so there's no way that she could have known whether that was a common pipistrelle or a soprano pipistrelle, which is one of the other 2 pipistrelle species that we have in the county. But she made that assumption. And then there's the other thing that if you look at historical records, there are, so for example, Alcathoe bat is recently discovered to have been separated from whiskered and Brandt's bats. And also, I think it was 1999, the soprano and common pipistrelle were separated reliably in the UK. And so any records before that date that say common pipistrelle, you can't trust that they were common pipistrelle because no one actually knew that there were soprano pipistrelles. And another huge thing is people who do know what they're doing, people who do know how to separate these bats, either acoustically or via behavior or any other method, they go to sites of known quality and species richness, which are often out of the county. So you get this kind of skew of the data from so many different angles. And then obviously another factor is the genuine abundance and distribution, but you have all these factors going into it. Anyway, so an example of this is, hopefully you can see these little red circles that have popped up. What you're looking at here is a species richness, like a density map. So the darker the square is, the more species have been recorded in that 2 kilometre square tetrad. And you could be forgiven for thinking that there are, like, say 5, maybe 7 hotspots around the county, 5 of which I've circled here. And just to drive my point home, these are my survey sites that I've been surveying for the last 2 years. So this is a map from up-to-date records. Wouldn't have looked like this 2 years ago. These are my survey sites. So this is what a little bit of recording effort, bearing in mind that nobody else is really doing any handling surveys apart from perhaps the odd bat box checks by licensed people. But this is how much a little bit of recording effort is having an effect on the distribution maps. So we've surveyed some less than 3% of the county's woodland, less than 1% of its greenbelt, and during the last 2 years reassessed the rarity indexes of 9 of the 11 extant county species, and then added a species that was presumed extinct. And it's not because they weren't here or they've just recently had a population explosion. It's because no one's looking for them, because that's the nature of urban biodiversity. We think there's nothing here. We don't bother looking for it. And so the record database perpetuates that myth that there's nothing here, that we have low diversity. Generally speaking, Pipistrellus and Nyctilis species are those considered to be the most resilient to the impacts of urbanization, and those that are sensitive are considered to be the Myotis, Placotis, and Eptesicus, unless you're on the continent, in which case Eptesicus goes in the other column, and Rhinolophus. We only have one Rhinolophus in the county and one Placotis. The Placotis is a brown long-eared bat, and Rhinolophus is the lesser horseshoe bat, which is pretty rare around here. So it's very easy to assume that, oh, well, some bats are doing okay because they're urban adapted. But even those that are considered well adapted are negatively impacted by increasing urbanization and are not doing well at all. So the Bat Conservation Trust does a State of the UK's Bats report, and even the bats that we consider to be doing well comparatively are not doing well. So factors affecting bat abundance, activity, and richness. Proximity to water and forest edge are huge. Presence of vegetation, tree density, and the abundance of their prey. Now, all bats in the UK are insectivores, and so although some are dependent on Lepidoptera, some are dependent on crane flies. So it depends on which almost anything you say about bats, the answer to every question is it depends on the species, and you'll see a lot of that species specificity as I go on. Negative things are lighting, noise, fragmentation, and urbanization. Now, the positive things, the water, vegetation, tree density, and prey abundance, can go quite some way to mitigating the negative effects of the others. So the thing is with bats is that their survival and their persistence in urban areas depends on their ability to exploit available food resources, available roosting resources. So pipistrelles, common pipistrelles, and noctules have both been recorded foraging around streetlights. Now, you would ordinarily think that streetlights are negative for bats, but they are positive for insects, as I'm sure that you've noticed if you've ever been outside at night near a street lamp. They attract moths and other insects. And so certain species, common pipistrelle and noctule, have learned to exploit that and will readily forage around it. And as I mentioned before, bats love a bit of central heating. Pipistrelle bats and soprano pipistrelles as well will quite readily set up shop. Oh, there's my cat, just popped up behind me. Will readily set up shop in your attic behind your boiler where it's nice and warm, because they're mammals. They have a large surface area for body mass, and they lose their heat very easily. And so anything that helps them to save calories is a winner. So with regard to roosting, depending on the species and also depending on what their natural roosting places are like. So if your natural tendency is to roost in trees, then you're much more likely to go into buildings. If your natural tendency is to roost in caves, then you're much more likely to utilize tunnels and bridges and things like that. So bearing in mind, a lot of these things are analogs for their natural roosting preferences. But houses, churches, school buildings, just absolutely any structure can be roosted in. Tunnels, bridges, mines and quarries. I'm going to show you some videos of a disused mine in a little bit. And also provided ones. So a lot of the time when we're doing development work in urban areas, mitigation schemes have to be put in place. And that will mean providing bat tiles, bat bricks, and sometimes bat boxes on nearby trees, or even built into actual new builds themselves. They build into the cavity wall these things called Ibstock bricks. And then also trees managed in urban green spaces. So this goes to meet the needs of the many different species of bats that we've got, but at different times of the year, because bats don't overwinter in the same place that they have a maternity roost. Most of the species, during the summer, the females have their pups in a separate maternity roost, and the males are off by themselves. They do what's called roost switching, fission-fusion behavior. So they're moving around from roost to roost quite a lot. So if a bat population doesn't necessarily just have one roost in one woodland, even if it is a woodland species, they'll be moving around quite a bit. And they do exhibit quite a lot of high roost fidelity, so they will come back to the same favored spots over and over again. So these different structures and roosting opportunities in an urban area, they tend to last for quite a long time, and they tend to support bats during different times of the year, and meet different needs of different species of bats and different sexes of bat. So bats are central place foragers. I'm sure you've probably covered this in lectures, but the idea is that everything they do is about calories in, calories out. The idea is they want to spend fewer calories than they consume, and that means that they need to have their foraging sites as close as possible to their roost sites. So which means that they need good quality roosts near good quality foraging grounds. And it's all about that trade-off between food and energy expended to get to that food. And that is where a lot of the problem comes in with barriers. So the distance between roosting and foraging areas can be a lot larger in urban areas than it is in rural areas, because there will be fewer trees. Maybe if particularly a lot of newer buildings tend to have fewer roosting opportunities than older buildings. And so the bats tend to have to travel further to get to where the good food is. So for central place foragers, they have to return to roost multiple times in a night. I think it's 3.7 times on average for pipistrelles. When they are lactating, though, the females have to keep coming back to feed their young throughout the night. So every trip costs calories, and so they need to eat a lot, to the extent where Dorbenton's bats come out during the lactation period. They come out to emerge to look for food 15 minutes earlier than they do at other times of the year, relative to sunset. Okay, so sorry, let me get back. I've got these in the wrong order. Sorry, my slides are in slightly the wrong order. But generally speaking, the things that are beneficial for bats are the vegetation, the fresh water, roosting opportunities, and intact commuting routes, which are safe and give them a reduced sense of risk of predation. And obviously, it's preferable to have less lighting, less noise, less fragmentation of habitat, and more connected habitats. Vegetation is a really important thing. So there's been positive correlations between the proximity to woodland foraging sites with urban areas. That fact that networks of trees and lines of trees can greatly mitigate the effects of urbanization. We're going to talk a bit more about the effects. But also that you can actually predict the presence of roosts at a 50-meter scale using vegetative cover. Another interesting thing is, and we're going to talk a bit more about Dorbenton's bats shortly, but they usually roost within 200 meters of water. You can almost always find them close to water. So Dorbenton's bats have a high dependency on water bodies. There are several other species which are documented to have an affinity with water, and Enthusiast pipistrelle for one of them. But most bats will use waterways, and they all need to drink. So even if they're not specialists, so Dorbenton's bats are what's called trawlers. So they pick up insects off the surface of water. And they've got massive hairy feet to help them do this. I think I have a picture of a massive hairy Dorbenton's foot slightly later on. And so basically they are incredibly faithful to their foraging sites, along which they commute down waterways to get to one or two favored foraging grounds. And Enthusiast pipistrelle as well is documented to have this affinity with water, and that's really important to them, but they all need to drink. And there's also the fact that water tends to mean insects, and for bats that means food. So whether or not they're trawling specialists or specifically have a habitat preference for aquatic environments, they all need to go to ponds to drink, and they will all get more food at ponds and aquatic areas than generally in the wider landscape. So a local study has shown that roost catchments around urban ponds tend to be around within 500 meters of a pond. So generally speaking, if you've got, one of the best things you can do to support bats and attract bats to your area would be to put a pond in. They are incredibly valuable. So with regard to barriers, we're going to talk about roads, noise, lighting, and open ground. And then once I've talked about barriers, we can have a break, and then I'm going to talk to you more about my actual research and what we're doing. So you're going to see some maps in a minute, which have got a 1.6 kilometer buffer around the motorways that go through our county. And this is because of a study by Altrincham that showed a significant reduction in bat activity within that area. Now, this tends to be, I think I talk about noise in a little bit, but it's not because of noise alone, because the effect of noise is a much smaller area. And bearing in mind that, and you'll see quite a bit of this, that the effects on different bats is very, very species specific. But broad brush, 1.6 kilometers is the area around a major road which you could expect there to be a deleterious effect on bat activity. So species like Myotis and Placotis, so Placotis being the long-eared bats, they are more highly affected by roads because of their foraging style, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the noise section in a second. But species which are high-flying or extremely urban adapted, like noctules, like pipistrelles, tend to be less affected by roads. So noctules will just fly straight over them. They're high-flying, long-winged, far-foraging bats, and they just don't care. And pipistrelles are just tough, and they're not, although they are affected, they're not affected anywhere near as much as brown long-eareds or Myotis bats. So here's your map. The shaded grey dotted areas are the 1.6 kilometer buffer around the M6 and M5 motorways, which you can see going through. Also, we've got from the Office for National Statistics in grey is the built-up areas of the conurbation. The white areas coincide a lot with what is designated as the West Midlands Green Belt. And then you can see overlaid in green are the National Forest Inventory. And you can see that most of the pockets of woodland within the county are completely landlocked with conurbation. And you can also see, I've got a map of the West Midlands Canal Network on here as well. So you can see that in a lot of areas, the canals are crossing over or under those huge motorway barrier areas. And that will become important shortly. But basically, the presence of roads affects the survival of bats. And there's an increase in direct mortality. So sometimes bats do try and cross these barriers and they just get hit by trucks. I've seen it happen. I've seen a noctule get hit by a truck. So the direct mortality is a real thing. And also when there's not an awful lot of necessary noise to kind of alert them to it, like railways can be a source of direct mortality as well. So it reduces their ability to disperse if they're unable to cross these barriers. And it also means that they sometimes have to opt for lower quality foraging sites or further away foraging sites. And that means that they might get less food, or they might have to burn more calories in order to get the same amount of food. And either way, that has a deleterious effect on their general health, their ability to reproduce, and their ability to hibernate and make it through the winter. So another thing that happens is avoidance behavior. So this is, again, a species-specific thing. So some species will try and just cross and occasionally get hit by trucks and cars, direct mortality. And then other species will just avoid the motorway. And so these become an absolute barrier to them. So you get calorific stress as a result of all of these things. Noise. So whereas the activity by roads in general affected bat activity to 1.6 kilometers, the noise is usually an effect up to 100 meters, so it's a lot less. I think in general with roads, you're talking about a combination of noise, vibration, and light, and the lighting is horrendous, which you'll see some photos of shortly. So again, it varies by species, like I'm saying on almost every page. But for some species, it's a lot more of an issue when it comes to noise because of the way that they forage. So you get what's called acoustic masking theory. So when the idea of all this background noise inhibits their ability to perceive sounds, and because, as I'm sure you know, bats live in a very acoustic environment. They're echolocating. They're finding their food with sound. I mean, they can see about as well as we can, which obviously at night is not that great, but still they can see. People say blind as a bat. That's a fallacy. They can see pretty well. But having said that, they are reliant on an acoustic soundscape to be able to get around and to be able to eat. And so certain species, again, this is to do with their ecology. So bats fall into what's called feeding guilds, and so some of the bats we have in the UK are called gleaners, and so they're in a gleaning feeding guild, which means that they are, rather than picking up species that are on the wing, they are picking species off of surfaces, leaves, even walls, spider webs, stuff like that. And that means that they're not after species that are buzzing around. They're after prey species that are sitting still. And so their echolocation has to be a lot more, have a lot more finesse to it. They have to be able to go after quieter prey. It suits them well because they're going after species that other bats aren't, and so there's less competition for that prey group. It also means that they can forage later into the year, and they don't have to. They can fatten up slightly later before hibernation and have an extended feeding period because they're not having to rely on vulnerable prey. But it does mean that they're particularly susceptible to acoustic masking. Now, species like Dorbenton's bats, traffic noise actually just triggers avoidance behavior. These are one of the species that will just not go near the motorway because of the noise. So they don't suffer from acoustic masking. As I said before, they're trawlers. They're picking up food off the surface of water or very close to the surface of water. And so they're not having to. They're very loud at echolocating, and they're not having to worry about being quiet and stealthy and picking up spiders and stuff like brown long-eared bats are, or Natter's bats. But they are completely affected by noise because they will just avoid it. So when it comes to noise, it reduces foraging efficiency. It directly reduces dispersal ability, and that is not only just from a point of it means that they can't get to the best or the closest foraging sites, but also it can mean genetically. So if you're stuck in one little area and you can't genetically disperse, especially for species like this, which are swarming species, which I guess I'll go into a little bit more about that, but then it's kind of a wormhole. But then as noise goes up, stress goes up. It's been measured cortisol levels in species subjected to high levels of noise on a persistent basis are definitely elevated. Avoidance behavior happens, and the distance between roost and foraging sites also increases, which then decreases the calories that they can take in. So, and then when it comes to lighting, so lighting has been documented to reduce bat drinking activity and general activity, especially, as I said, brown long-eared bats and Natter's bats, but also the other Myotis, whiskered brown Salcothoe all fall into that as well. And one of the interesting things is it delays roost emergence. Different bat species emerge at a different time relative to sunset. So the early bats that you will see come out will be stuff like Nyctalus, Aptesicus, the big bats. They tend to come out while it's still light in the sky. Sometimes you'll still see them in the summer when there's swifts flying around. And then you get your pipistrelles come out at around sort of 20 minutes after sunset, just as it's getting dark. And then generally speaking, your Myotis and your brown long-eared bats, the ones that are most sensitive to noise and lighting, they tend to come out when it's fully dark, like 50 to 60 minutes after sunset. Although there are regional variations, and every species is very slightly different. But generally speaking, lighting delays their roost emergence, which, as you can imagine, truncates the feeding window, and especially for lactating females who have to keep coming back to their roost. All of these things combine together to mean that they've got perhaps a less lucrative foraging site that's possibly further away from than what would be ideal with regard to optimum foraging theory. They're having to come back several times during the night to feed their young. And rather than in a perfect world coming out 15 minutes early during the lactation period, their emergence is actually delayed because of lighting. So there's like a 1 lux thing with Daurbentons, for example. So Daurbentons won't, generally speaking, come out of their roost if the ambient lighting is greater than 1 lux, which is basically a full moon. And you'll see from some photos that I'm going to show you shortly that the lighting in some of the areas where I've been surveying is definitely brighter than that. So it just, and also it will disrupt movement along established commuting routes. So when a new development goes up or a new industrial estate goes up with these horrendous lights that go on and there's no need for them to be on, and there's loads of lights spill onto what was a dark canal, that can completely disrupt the normal commuting routes of a population of bats, and it will be an entire population. An interesting study is that hedge lighting has resulted in a huge barrier effect for lesser horseshoe bats, and they found that lesser horseshoe bats will actually go around to the dark side of a hedge in order to be able to get past it. So here's a few photos from last year, different survey sites. So what you can see on the top left is that is under the M6 at Roughwood, so just north of Junction 10. And you can see that that's awful light spill, and it's not even dark yet, and there's that much light spill. Top right is a railway signal light at Dudleyport train station, which runs adjacent to the canal. I'll mention this again a little bit later, but basically this is a site where we've actually seen even noctules deviate when the lights are on this bright setting. And then you can see here, this is just outside of Walsall, the bottom left, just the horrendous, like, you can see that where I'm standing to take the picture is actually quite dark, and that's one of the interesting things that we're going to talk about slightly later on, is the blue bridge effect. But then this is the bottom right is one of the worst ones. It was a really, really beautiful post-industrial bit of canal that when I did my daytime visit, I was like, this is so batty. There's loads of vegetation, there's loads of roosting opportunities, lots of old cracks and crevices, and there's a tunnel. It's going to be perfect. And then we got there, and that was the lighting, and there were no bats. And we went back 3 times, and there were basically no bats. So here you go with lighting. It reduces the amount of time that a bat can forage. It reduces their caloric intake as a result, and their fitness, and their ability to reproduce. And another thing when it comes to calories that's really important when you think about bats is that they have to fatten up enough every year to be able to make it through hibernation. So they mate in the autumn, and they use delayed fertilization. So the female stores the sperm inside her for the hibernation period, wakes up in the spring, becomes pregnant, gives birth in June, and then the babies are flying by sort of August. And then the females and the babies all have to be fat enough to hibernate by October. So it's a very, very, very short, high stress, high pressure game of calories, their entire life cycle. So avoidance behavior goes up. With lighting, one of the huge things is the reason why you get this avoidance of emergence when it's that bright is because it increases their perceived risk of predation. And another thing is fragmentation, because some bats just won't cross open ground, and this is one of them. This is a lesser horseshoe bat, one of the Rhinolophidae, one of our rarest bats in the county. They're super cool. And basically, different bats will cross moderate gaps of open landscape, but in order to be able to do most of their moving around through the landscape, they need linear features or wooded cover. And so you can imagine things like golf courses are essentially might as well be concrete when it comes to bats, because they need wooded cover and they need linear features. So the implications really are that it inhibits their access to favored habitats, and how far away those habitats are, and how quality a habitat they can afford to fly to calorifically. It can reduce gene flow, quantity and quality of food, and then it has a direct impact on their own fitness and the survival of their young. And in general, over time, this causes decline in populations. So bats are a case-selected species. They have one young per year, and they're extremely long-lived. They several years ago, found a Brandt's bat that was that had been ringed 40 years ago. And if you think about something like a mouse would have in the wild, a life expectancy of 6 to 18 months. 40 years is an incredibly long time for a mammal of that size. But it's necessary because in order to be able to keep their population numbers up, because they only have one young a year. Now, this I'm talking about Vespertilionidae, our bats we have in the UK, but also specifically in a temperate climate. So it's different in the tropics, where you might have polyester species that have several young a year because they don't have to worry about hibernating. So when I'm talking about these impacts, I'm talking them from a very UK-centric point of view. But it also slows the recovery when habitats are created, because if conservation action happens in an area like ours, which it desperately needs, the beneficial effects are slowed down because of these barrier effects caused by noise, lighting, and roads, and fragmentation. And it also means that if there is a loss, a population, or a gap in a niche that could be filled because by neighboring populations, they're slow to recruit new individuals to fill those population sinks. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos. I have no idea if you're going to hear the sound on these. I don't know if there is sound on the first one, but I just wanted to show you a couple of videos of some urban bats doing what they do. And then we will take a break for a few minutes, get yourself some coffee, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about my project, basically, in the field work that I'm doing and how all of that is working. So hopefully this will work. Really dodgy IR cameras, really cheap ones, by the way, so they're not great, but you can just about make out the bats flying around in there. This is actually underneath Dudley Zoo. And these are Natterer's bats, I believe. So what I've done here is I've just set up an IR camera next to a harp trap. And we'll talk a bit more about the traps and stuff that I use after the break. And you can see them flying around. Right, the next one is, right, this is a disused limestone mine in Warsaw on a private site, and is one of the only sites in the county where we have got lesser horseshoe bats. These bats in here are door bentons, though. I don't know if you can hear it, but you might be able to hear it because I've got bass detector on, so. So you see these bats are flying out and then coming back in. They're doing pre-emergence behavior, or what people call light sampling behavior. So they're coming out, just doing a bit quick recce to see if it's okay to come out, if they feel safe, if they have that risk of predation sense. And they're coming out into the dark. So and this is pre-emergence behavior, happens all the time. I'll talk a bit more when we talk about tunnels. That's pretty cool. Okay. Right, so take a break, and we'll come back at 5 past and talk a bit about fieldwork, show you the cool stuff we've been up to. Okay, and if you have any questions in the meantime, just stick them in the chat. I'm gonna go and fill my coffee up, and I will be back. I'm just gonna turn my camera off for a minute. So I'll see you about 5 past. Okay, welcome back. Hope you all have coffee. I am now gonna, so now you've had the kind of like the background about kind of how bats react to barriers in an urban landscape, a bit about just sort of general urban ecology theory. So what I'm going to talk to you about is the two different types of surveys that I'm doing, but mostly we'll be talking about the one type. But so okay, so here we are back with the county map, and you have the county potentially divided into three areas by the M6 and M5 motorways. So what you can see here is those three areas, and you can see in orange, these are my advanced survey study sites. Some of them have not yet been done. Some of them have been done. I have one more year of advanced surveys left, which we were supposed to be starting. What day is it? It's supposed to be starting on Friday, but it's too cold, so it's not going to happen. But we're doing other surveys. So basically what I'm trying to do is get a genetic sample from each of these areas, from several different species of bats, and to see if there is, from a microsatellite point of view, if there is any difference, if they're one population or if there are sort of smaller populations. Another thing I want to do is, so if you have a look at the top of the map, you can see Sneed Reservoir and Rough Wood. So those are two sites that are very close together, but they have the M6 motorway between them. And so what I want to know is, are the bats at Sneed Reservoir more closely related to the bats in Rough Wood, which is closer, or are they more closely related to the bats at Door End Woodlands off to the east, which is further away, but there is basically nothing in the way of major roads in between them. Bearing in mind that a canal does connect the two, so for species that are utilizing the canal to go under the motorway, that I would expect that barrier not to exist for those species. So onward. ABLSTs are advanced bat license survey techniques, and that is the, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I just wanted to sort of show you what we're doing, some cool pictures of bats. So essentially it's bat trapping surveys. So what we do is we catch bats at each of these sites. We identify them to species level, and we record the sex, the breeding condition, the age class, and then we also take various other bits of information, morphometric data, that tells us a bit more about how the bats are doing. So, for example, we take forearm length and we take weight, and that gives us body condition index. Because even bats of the same species, they're not all an identical size. So their forearms will vary by a number of millimeters. And so if we were just comparing weight, that wouldn't really tell us very much. So we need to know weight for forearm length body condition index, which some people poo-poo and say is not useful piece of information. I think it is. And then also we're taking DNA samples, oral swabs of each of these, each of the bats that we catch. This is the equipment that we use. We use mist nets. I don't know if any of you have seen bird ringing done before, but basically it is just like a series of nets that have pockets essentially in them, and the bats hit the net, drop into the pocket, and then we extract them. So you can see, I'll go back a slide. You can see that being done. That's me doing it in the top left, and then you can't really see the nets, but yeah. So you can see basically that that's a brown long-eared bat. He's sitting in a pocket, and I'm just taking him out. The other kit that we use are called harp traps, and they kind of look like what you think something called a harp trap would be called. They are vertical strings. We use triple bank harp traps, which is 3 sets of vertical strings, and the idea is a bat flies into them. They're nylon strings, so they don't hurt the bat. The bat hits it, drops it into a pocket, and it works a bit like a lobster pot. So they try to crawl up, and they hit these little baffles, and they just sit in there until we take them out. And we also use acoustic lures. So we're playing pre-recorded or libraries, or occasionally you can get synthesized social calls of bats to lure them in to the traps, and they work really well. On the right-hand side, you can see a specifically designed one, but it was designed by a guy named Neil Middleton, and we built that, and that is for hanging over bridges over canals. to record passing bats. And what the cool thing about that is you also get the direction of travel of the bat because you know which way it hit the pocket. Well, you know that anyway, but you know, it's for a linear feature like a canal, it's really useful. Cute pictures of bats. Here you go. So on the left is a Brad's bat. That was the species that was previously thought to be locally extinct, and we've recorded it now at 5 sites. And then you have a very angry-looking nocturnal bat, which is our largest species in the UK. A super chilled soprano pipistrelle in the middle. Very typical soprano pipistrelle with his piggy nose and very pale face. And then there is a Leisler's bat, also known as lesser noctule. And that was only recently, we've only recently caught that in nets. We've caught it twice ever. So they're pretty elusive. And then the lesser horseshoe bat on the right-hand side. So we have 12 county species. We think of those, the ones we haven't caught are Serotine and Nethusius pipistrelle. So watch this space, I guess. And then we do DNA analysis, and that's being done with swabbing, doing oral swabbing. As you can see, sort of like, so you can tell the picture that was taken this year compared to the pictures that were taken in previous years, because now we're all masked up because of COVID, which is quite interesting because we're not worried about, well, we are worried about obviously catching COVID from each other. What we're wearing the masks for is to prevent transmission of SARS-CoV-2 to bats. And so that's part of the IUCN's new protocol for research. And it's called the MAP protocol, Minimize, Assess, Protect. And this is part of the PPE, so we now wear masks whenever we're handling bats. Okay, I don't know why I have a random picture of a bat. There, he must be supposed to be on the previous slide. Oh no, it's a video. Ha ha ha! This is a release video. So this is the little Leisler's bat, I think. Is he a Leisler's bat? A noctule bat. Looks like a Leisler's bat. Getting ready to be released. You might hear me talking to the bat like an idiot. Just ignore that. You didn't hear it. I'm way more science than that. I don't talk to bats.
You doing okay? You ready to go? There's your tree. My dear.
No, that's a noctule. Not a Leisler's.
I love that you're making like growly science marker noises in the middle of my noctule video.
Okay, so you'll see that I release that bat by letting it climb up a tree. We do that with the larger bats, noctules, Leisler's, and Serotines, if we ever catch Serotine. And that's just because if you release it from your hand like you would a normal bat, then it wouldn't get enough lift. So this is a release of, I think, a Natterer's bat. So in slow motion for your viewing pleasure. There you go. So you may notice that those bats have got white on their legs, both of them. And that's because we use a chalk marker to mark the legs of all the bats that we release so that if they're dumb enough to hit the nets again, we don't process them a second time and subject them to additional stress. So that's the trapping surveys. I wanted to show you that just because it's got cool bat pictures and videos. And also because it's relevant from the DNA point of view. But the bulk of the work with regard to barriers is a survey technique that I've devised called multi-point activity surveys. And it's designed for using Dorbenton's bats as an analog for other species to monitor the way that they're moving around the linear features of the conurbation, specifically our canal network. So Dorbenton's bat is Myotis dorbentonii. As I've said before, they are trawling bats. There you go, as promised, large, enormous, hairy foot. They're like hobbits with wings. They're giant. They catch things on the surface of the water, massive feet. They're also super chilled bats. When you catch them in nets, they're really, really chilled out. Very cool bats. Kind of ugly though. They have kind of an ugly face, but we don't really talk about that. So as I said before, they visit one or two favored feeding grounds because of optimal foraging theory. They tend to be within 2 kilometers of where their roost is, and their roost is usually within 200 meters of the water course along which they commute to those foraging grounds. So sometimes they will use hedgerows for commuting, but usually it's waterways. And they fly very close to the surface of the water. How close, you might ask? Well, according to Altrincham, that is within 1 meter. Depending on which books you read, these are the figures, but generally speaking, it's about a foot or within a foot of the water surface. Now, this habit of flying in this predictable manner along a predictable route at a predictable time of night allows me to be able to use some really lo-fi techniques to be able to monitor bats as they move along waterways. Now, normally, if you're going to track a commuting route of a bat, you would need to trap the bat, attach a radio tag, have special licenses. It's very expensive, and then track that bat. And then obviously you go through all of that, and you only get 1 bat worth of data. Whereas doing this, I can track the movements of every bat that goes along the section of canal in which I'm surveying. You'll see. So, using a combination of acoustic monitoring and visual observations, where we watch these bats go past us, and then we track from several different points. That's why it's called a multi-point activity survey. Several different survey teams along a section of canal, and we compile all of these movement data into QGIS at the end, and it enables us to be able to identify commuting routes, the direction in which the bats came from, where they might be heading to, and lots of quantitative and qualitative data about how they're moving around the landscape, in spite of these horrendous lights either side of the motorway. So the idea is that I can do this with a team of surveyors that don't necessarily have to have a lot of experience. By and large, the equipment isn't expensive. You could technically do this with 4 LED torches and 4 like 50 quid bat detectors. You don't need a lot of expensive equipment. We are using tablets and full spectrum bat detectors, but you could do this with much less expensive equipment. And no handling is required, no disturbance of bats. It's very easy to separate calls of Dor Benton's bats from those of other bats, especially if you have something like these Echometer Touch detectors, which is what we use, because they plug into your smartphone or your tablet, and you see the sonogram live as the bat is going past you. You do need, because you're using torches, disturbing bats with a torch is a licensable activity, so you need at least 1 person under whom everybody else is operating, under whose license everybody else is operating, and that just needs to be a Class 1 license. So when people talk about getting a bat license, they're usually referring to a Class 2 license. And the way that I do this is 4 teams of 2 surveyors for most surveys. Obviously, at the moment, we're operating under Rule of 6, which is a nightmare for me because it means that my survey teams have to be all tweaked, and I'm having to front load survey types that take fewer people. Like tonight, we're out timing bats, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, because I can do that with 6 people rather than 8. But the main thing is, like, because we're working on canals at night, I can't have anybody alone working, so it has to be in teams of 2, and we do need 4 survey points for it to work, really. So, right, this is the kit. So they have a walkie-talkie, a detector and tablet, a red light torch, 2 clicker counters, and that's for counting the bats that go in each direction past the survey team. And then there's a few bits of sort of health and safety stuff. Like they also get, like, you know, those hazard triangles that you put in your car, and a little clip-on light just to let people know that there's a survey team on the path and stuff. And these reflective armbands. And everything is in like a little neoprene pouch, and they just get like a little survey kit to take out with them. And the way that it works is just like this. The detector and the torch are positioned on the towpath facing the opposite bank. Because of the range, the acoustic range, sort of spatially wise, of the bat detector, you get a couple of seconds of heads up before a bat goes through your torch. And so basically we make sure that there's no vegetation in the way, that all the settings on all the detectors are all set up exactly the same, and then everything's positioned like this. You can actually see that that is a Dor Benton's bat on the screen there. And the reason that you can tell that is because 2 things. One is a lot of what you call frequency modulation. So it's a big long call rather than like a little tadpole shape. It's slightly leaning back. So it's like slightly S-curved. And it has what we call cone filtering, which is because the bat's flying so close to the water surface, it interferes with its own signal. And so that's a very typical Dor Benton's call on there. just FYI. This is the software that we use. So I collect the movement data on EpiCollect, and then the detectors come with software that is a free app for Android or iOS, whichever you're using. And then we also wanted to calibrate to figure out what the best settings were, and to determine whether or not we could rely on the auto ID. So these detectors have an auto identification feature built in that you can use, and you set that to whatever country you're in, which is great if you're on holiday and you want to know what you're listening to bat detector wise. You go out, take your bat detector, and you're listening to stuff. But like when I go back to Florida, it thinks that my brother's front door is a Florida bonneted bat. So they're not perfect. And because I knew they weren't perfect, I was like, well, I don't think we can rely on these. And I needed to be able to prove that that the source of truth for the survey is visual observations. So this was a setup of 4 detectors on sensitive, balanced, accurate, and then control where there was no auto ID going on. And then they're all set up, press record at the same time. And then basically I let them auto ID, and then on the control I did a manual identification of all of the sound files that were recorded. And at best, it recorded to species level Daubenton's bats 24% of the time. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this disparity, considering it's supposed to work so well. Because if you were going out to the site and you just wanted a species list, it did pick up all the species that I picked up. It did. But what I'm not after species, I'm after passes. And the other problem is with bats, especially if they're commuting from a roost to a foraging ground, they come through in cohorts. So a visual observer will see 3 bats go through the torch, like boom, 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 go through the torch. The detector thinks it's recorded 1 bat because it's got 1 recording. And so you underestimate the number of bats that are going past. Whereas what we want for the survey is to record the movements of every single bat that makes contact with any survey team. So after running these calibration tests, it was decided that the source of truth was visual observations. So in preparation for the surveys, I had to sort of decide how I was going to standardize the start and finish times and how long each survey would be. I'm not interested in foraging bats. I'm not interested in the same bats coming back. I'm just interested in bats going from roost on their nightly initial commute from their roost to their foraging grounds. And so I didn't want to get to a point where I was going to get bats coming back. So I didn't want the survey to last more than an hour. Then I looked at all of the published emergence times, which, as you can see, are horrendous in variability. And then this is that paper that Luke in 2009 is that paper of them emerging 14 minutes earlier during post-parturition period while they're lactating to get in those extra feeding minutes. And then I thought, well, what existing surveys are there for Daubentons? So the National Bat Monitoring Programme Bat Conservation Trust Waterway Survey focuses on Daubenton's bats, and it starts 40 minutes after sunset and lasts for an hour. So that's more like what I was looking at. But I didn't want to miss emergence if I was doing surveys later in the year, and then we did have that early emergence in the post-parturition period. So my surveys start at 30 minutes after sunset and last for 60 minutes. And then basically at each team, there is an observer and a communicator, OBS and comms. So OBS's job is to watch and listen for passing bats. When a bat goes through, they say bat in or bat north, depending on what type of survey they're doing, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And they click a bat on the clickers in the direction that it's going. And then the person, their survey partner, will immediately radio, say they are survey team alpha, they will say alpha bat in. So all the other bats know that a bat has come into the junction or into the section of canal or whatever, and they should be expecting a bat. Then they check the detector to make sure it's a Daubenton's. And if it wasn't a Daubenton's, they'll just go, never mind, it wasn't a Daub. But the person who's in charge of doing the observations doesn't look at the detector because A, it ruins their night vision, and B, it means they're not looking at the torch. So the lead is me. I collate all the information that everybody says, but basically the idea is every bat that comes into the survey area, I know where it went. And it works, and it works really well. It sounds a little convoluted. It's actually a lot more simple than it sounds. We put people at various intervals down the canal, and we record what bats go past them in which direction at what time. This is how it works. So a bat is flying north down the canal, goes past team Delta, and Delta say, Delta, bat north. that means that Charlie knows to expect a bat in 30 seconds. And the reason it needs to expect a bat in 30 seconds is because these survey points are about 200 meters apart. And so it goes past and past and past. I don't know why it's bloody automatically advancing my slides, but basically the idea is if the bat continues to go past Charlie, past Bravo, but never reaches Alpha, like that, and this happens over and over and over again, we can infer that there is a hop-off point between Bravo and Alpha, and the same thing for hop-on points. Yeah. So standard survey model, everyone is 200 meters apart. Recording bats heading north or south, east or west, whatever, you just choose your orientation. And then basically you can move down the stretch of canal on subsequent nights, and you can cover a huge area and get an idea of where all the hop-on and hop-off points are. And then you can follow those up with crossing point surveys to see where the bats are actually going. You're not going to see anything in this video until the very, very end. I'm hoping that you could, I don't know if you could hear the videos earlier. Could someone let me know if you could hear them? Because there's not a lot point in me playing this if you can't. So the idea is, yes, you could. Okay, great. Oh, hang on a minute. I'm stopping it. I'm going to rewind it. We're going back up one. Okay, so what you're going to hear is the radio comms of a bat going past Bravo, Alpha to Omega and Psi. And basically, 3 bats go past Bravo. 3 bats go, nothing hits Bravo. So the hop-on point is between Bravo and Alpha. 3 go past Alpha, 3 go past Omega, and then 2 hit Psi. And what I've done is I've cut out the 30 seconds in between each one. So you get an idea. Hopefully I'll be able to. I want to be able to rewind it. My thing has stuck. All right. Try again. Here we go. And go.
Omega north. Alpha Servo. Omega north. Omega north. Omega north.
Try that more. And then if you keep your eyes peeled, blink and you'll miss it, you'll see the bat fly past here. Oh, there he goes. That's using a really crappy 20 quid infrared camera. So, and you'll have heard me say Psi bat north, that's a catch. So a catch is when a bat goes between any 2 survey points. One of the things that we needed to be certain of was how long it would take for a bat to get from one point to another point. Now we know the distance, so we obviously need to know the bat speeds. And that's what I'm out doing tonight, is collecting more data, because as you can see, it's not a very nice fancy bell curve. It needs to be better, I need more data points. But in the initial surveys, we know that using fixed point photography in the 80s, they clocked bats at 3.4 to 3.9 meters a second. Commuting flight of daubs in terrestrial edge habitats has been is a lot faster. And then in the vegetative tunnels, 5.6. And then Neil Middleton up in Scotland, the guy who designed the big thing, the trap that hangs over the waterways, 5.4 meters a second. So we did this rather than, I mean, Neil Middleton used some really fancy sort of automated stuff using bat detectors, but we just do this using stopwatches and torches. And that's what I should be doing tonight, freezing my bum off on the canal in Dudley, timing bats as they go past us. And as you can see, these are nowhere near, these are, I think we're at 25 or 33 meter spacing down here. We basically monitor a 100 meter stretch of canal, and we both start our stopwatches at the same time. And then when a bat goes past mine, I press stop, and when the bat goes past the last person's, they press stop. And the difference between the 2 stopwatches is how long it took the bat to fly 100 meters. So using that method, we came up with 5.7 meters a second, which is 0.3 MPS away from Middleton's, which I'm really happy with. I mean, I might completely mess it up tonight, but we'll see. But yeah, so this is again more of the prep work that we did, so that we can actually say, yeah, we can anticipate bats along a straight stretch of canal flying this fast, and then we have to do it again along a curved stretch of canal. So there you go. So this is the basic. I've just explained it to you. The basic methodology. Everybody gives a verbal cue as the bat goes past their torch, and then we calculate the difference in the time between the two stopwatches, and then reset and do it again, as many as we can get. So this is this is me training my volunteers how to do the survey. So there's not an actual bat, because as you can see, it's daytime. It's a fake bat, but you get an idea of how it works. It's very quiet. Sorry, this video is awful. So that's synchronizing our stopwatches. In reality, it happens a lot faster than this, because the bats fly at 5.7 meters a second. So they zoom past really, really quickly. It takes like 15 seconds to make the whole transit. So it happens real fast. But this was literally just training volunteers on the first day we ever did it, on how the field testing would work. So. Okay, so there are, again, through the magic of Microsoft icons, there are a number of survey models for this. So on the left-hand side, you can see the timing bat survey model, as you can see, with the fancy stopwatches held by the first and last surveyor. Another thing we're doing this year, which is, again, another thing I'm doing in the spring while we're still on Rule of 6, is looking at the behavior of bats on a lock. Because obviously, if a bat comes off the bottom end of a lock, in order for the survey method to be viable, I've got to wait until the bat has dropped down to sort of like cruising altitude. And so I need to know how far away that tends to be, so I can say this method should be used as a minimum 50 meters away from any locks. So, and then we've also used it at bridges and tunnels to get roost counts from tunnels, to determine whether bats will readily go under the motorway. They totally do. They just don't care. They're in the canal. They feel safe. It's vegetated. They just go under the motorway. Motorway is not a barrier for Dahl-Benton's bats when using canals. And then we've got our standard survey model, where we're 200 meters apart, and then the junction survey model, which is the one I'm going to be concentrating on this year, and the one that gives us the most interesting landscape scale data. So rather than saying north and south, you say in, as in toward into the junction, or out away from the junction. Excuse me. Everybody is 100 to 150 meters distant from the junction center down each branch, if possible. Sometimes you have to move them. And that gives us an idea that it should take around 20-25 seconds for the bat to get from, say, Alpha into the middle at Zulu and then out to Bravo. So I sit at Zulu. You can see there's additional torches placed around the center, so that just gives me a bit of a heads up so I can tell people if there's a bat heading in their direction. And all passes are recorded in and out, and some of them will be Alpha to Bravo, some will be Alpha to Zulu, some will be Alpha to no catch because they're just jumping off and going somewhere else. But either way, we record it all. This should have gone earlier. This is to do with the fact that in the survey model, if you're using these detectors, you can get some false positives with hop on and hop off points, because basically we're looking at a mean of 29.4 meters distant. So that's how far away you can pick up a bat. Which is why the bat detector faces the opposite bank rather than facing downstream or upstream, so that we're standardizing everything. So the results of the surveys so far are that Dahl-Bentons will readily use canal underpasses to cross motorways. I haven't had a single one turn around, whereas I have had some pipistrelles turn around. They will also use canal, let's just say aqueducts, as narrow as 1 meter. So the bats will fly. We'll use that to fly over a dual carriageway. And not only that, we've seen pipistrelles on a regular basis use this blue bridge. They divert from their normal flight to cross over this and then come back to their original flight route. So they do this because it's a safer way to cross the road than it is to just jump, even at a high level, to jump over because of the fear of predation risk. They can stay quite close. It's dark. And then also this is the site where we have seen noctules flying over this and using this, but you can see that railway signal light is green. When that railway signal light is yellow, they leave. And so we're collecting more data on that this year. We're hoping to publish a paper on that. So Daubenton's will utilize canal tunnels up to 3 kilometers long to commute. They appear to anyway. There's no way, unless we're actually radio tagging them, there's no way to be 100% sure that it's exactly the same bat, but we do have a lot of evidence to suggest that bats are traveling 3 kilometers underground. And it also allows us to get accurate counts of tunnel roosts. So we take all the bats that come in and out at either end of the tunnel that are recorded simultaneously, and then the number of bats out minus the number of bats in is the number of bats that were tenants that are roosting inside the tunnel. It's a really good way to get tunnel roost counts. But this is the gravy. This is the how the data from junctions look when you put it into QGIS. So what I've done here is I've put weighted arrows. So the thickness of the arrow is proportional to the number of bats going in that direction. With the smallest arrows, the smallest I will make them is 10%. So everything that's less than 10% of movements is plotted at 10%, because otherwise they get too small and you can't see them. So you can see from, oops, back up again. You can see from this map that most of the bats come out of the tunnel is down here that you're just looking at. They come out of the tunnel and they immediately just leave. They go over the railway and they go to this pool for foraging. It's obviously a very popular foraging place for Daubenton's bats. Straight out of the tunnel, straight to the foraging area. And there are some bats that commute up and down here, but that tends to be more or less an even number. But the vast majority go to this site, Sheepwash, if any of you are familiar with it, if you're local people. And then this is another site, and most of the bats are commuting up and down here and not coming from the Thames Valley Canal here, with slightly more going south than going north. And that, and if we put these onto the map, you can see them here. So this is Sheepwash Reserve, just north of the lower QGIS map. All those big pools, that's where the bats are going to. And it appears that that's where the bats are probably going to from the site to the north as well, because what we then do is do a bit of a qualitative analysis on what features look like there'd be of value to bats. So I've got the roost at the bottom where the little bats are. The two kind of like Stonehenge looking dudes are caves, where we know that there are bat populations surrounded by woodlands. And then the red arrows are known movements of bats, and the green arrows are assumed movements of bats, because the bats are moving south along that northern bit of canal. The only thing that's really of interest to bats is Sheepwash Nature Reserve, and if they don't leave the canal at the point where I think they'll be leaving the canal, then they're going to hit a load of locks. So what we're going to do is a standard multipath survey at that point, and then where we've got some of the bats leaving the canal outside the tunnel and heading west, that is heading towards another junction. And so we're going to do a junction survey there. So the general idea is these are all the junctions in the Black Country, all the main canal junctions, and we will have surveyed all of them by September, by the end of September. And so we'll have an idea of how bats are moving along from every junction and on the whole of the Black Country Canal network. So that is basically it. That is the approach to the surveys. I'm happy to answer questions. You can go to urbanbatproject.com and see what other kind of stuff we're doing, or you can email me, or you can find me on social media as well. But if you have any questions, now's the time. Actually, now is not necessarily the time. Now can be the time, or you can send me a message later or whatever. I'm going to give you 1 minute to ask questions while I get my coffee, which is cold. Most interesting or shocking thing that I found. One was rediscovering Brandt's bat at so many sites. Just the realization that these bats are not as rare as we thought. They're just under-recorded, just nobody's looking for them. And that has really put me on a bit of a mission to, you know, to make people realize what, how much we're undervaluing urban habitats. Because the thing is, we underestimate them, we undervalue them, we think that nothing's here, so we don't record here. And when we don't record here, that means there's no record, so that people who are doing planning applications and consents then undervalue the sites. We lose the habitats. It's like we undervalue it because we're not recording it, and then because we're not recording it, we undervalue it, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle of dismissiveness about urban wildlife. Am I taking on new volunteers at the moment? If you go to urbanbatproject.com, you can fill out the application form. Sort of, not for trapping is the answer, but from multipass surveys, then yeah, people are welcome to get involved. You need your own transport and stuff like that because of COVID. Everyone has to travel like separately to surveys and things. So. But yes, there's certainly opportunity to get involved. Yeah, I think the other kind of cool stuff has just been just how readily these bats, Dor Benton's bats, which are supposedly so noise averse and so light averse, because they're in their safe place, because they're in the canal, they go under the motorway, which should be a barrier. It should be a barrier to quite an extent. I mean, the other thing is that, yeah, their behavior when they go over aqueducts is quite odd. Their flight behavior changes. So I'm getting a thermal camera, and major differences since COVID. What do you mean? Okay, use of the torches. If you use a white light, the bats turn around and just go the hell home. They don't like it. They don't like white light. If you use a red LED light, they are not bothered by it. But yeah, so when the bats hit the aqueducts, they tend to start doing this zigzag flight. And I'm getting a thermal camera. I'm going to try and document that this year because I think that's quite significant. I think they're testing because it suddenly narrows so much. I think that they're testing the boundaries of the channel that they're flying in because they stay down low. Major differences since COVID. Not with regard to bats or their populations. I certainly have noticed that anytime you tell people in a public forum that you study bats, everyone's like, oh, COVID. Like we were out doing site recce's week before last up at Pelsall, North Common, and there were a bunch of kids that are going, oh, bats have got COVID, bats have got COVID. And it's just the misinformation that you're fighting against constantly is significant. And people are wrong. And all the way through lockdown, I did a lot of sort of like live bat walks and stuff, to bats lives for the local bat group on their Facebook page. And we got a lot of questions about that. And I think there's just so much misinformation. And I just dread to think that, first of all, the impact that it's having on conservation being that most research has ground to a halt because of IUCN hitting the brakes. Like, for example, I also run a bat box scheme. That's not going ahead because that's not non-postponable research. So there's lots of really valuable research all over the world not happening now because we're trying to be cautious about bats and bat handling. But signs are looking good. There's been a couple of good papers that think that it's not as likely that we're going to transmit it to them. That there was a study on big brown bats where they actually tried to give them COVID and they didn't get COVID. And it also looks like PPE is very effective. I can post a couple of papers if people are interested, but it looks like the PPE is quite good at protecting bats and things like caves and roosts if people are wearing PPE. But so from that point of view, but then also I just think that in general, the wider population blame bats partly for what's happened, when basically the problem isn't a bat problem. The problem is a human problem. We're encroaching on their habitats. We're putting animals in wet markets. This is an anthropogenic disease. It might have a reservoir in wildlife, but this is an anthropogenic disease. But unfortunately, the amount that people want to support bat conservation is bound to be affected because of the amount of misinformation out there, which is horrendous. Well, that was a cheerful note to end on. Wow. This is the first time I've done a talk for the uni that I haven't put a picture of bat genitals in, and I really feel like I should have thrown that in at the end just to cheer everybody up now. But next time I promise, bat genitals. All right. Well, I am gonna end the call then, and give you your 14 minutes of free time. Finish with the cat. I don't know where she is. You in here? Yeah, come here. You hungry? People want to say hi. No, she's not having it. Sorry, she's very nocturnal. Okay. Well, if you if you have any other questions, feel free to drop me a line or tweet me or message me on Instagram or whatever. All my details are here. I'm going to upload the slideshow without videos, and that's it. Yeah. So basically, you can email me or get in touch and check out the website. And I hope that this has been interesting for you. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys.